Hello and welcome. My name is Kara Bloomberg, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Landrum HR. We are the parent company of HRQ. We believe an effective people strategy creates a better place to work and drives bottom line results. For those of you that aren't familiar with HRQ or Landrum HR, HRQ helps organizations develop enterprise-wide talent solutions through integrated consulting, interim, and search services. Our consulting team brings a depth of experience in workforce planning and analytics. Our team also works with clients on talent management strategy and projects with org design and HR transformation needs. In addition, we provide HR on-call services, virtual learning offerings, and in high demand right now, our methodology around rapid resource optimization. In 2019, HRQ joined forces with Landrum HR in order to provide end-to-end talent solutions for clients as one of our 4 divisions. Our other divisions offer PEO services, worksite management and staffing solutions, and insurance. You can learn more about all of our services and register for our events by visiting our website, landrumhr.com and hrqinc.com. Our next webinar will be July 30th on building a better business with diversity and inclusion. We will explore the ever-changing and complex topic of diversity and inclusion and why it's needed for your business, plus strategies you can use within your team. The link for the registration is in the chat feature of the control panel, or you can visit our website at hrqinc.com. A few items to point out before we get started. Please feel free to ask questions using the question pane in the control panel. Everyone that registered will receive a link to this presentation. And a quick survey is going to pop up as we exit the webinar today, and we'd love for you to take a moment to provide your feedback. I'd like to introduce Brian Wilkerson. Brian has held senior leadership roles in both large enterprises and global consulting firms. He is a successful entrepreneur, having founded and led a consulting and software company that was sold in 2007. He's a deep specialist in driving innovative strategies and using cutting-edge planning techniques, and he has worked around the globe. Brian is a frequent invited speaker and is sought by the press for his insight. He's authored a number of articles and book chapters. Thanks, Brian. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Kara. I appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for attending today. This is the second in our series of quarterly updates on the overall state of the economy and what companies should be thinking about based on where the economy is heading, and especially looking at what they should be thinking about in terms of their talent. I'm going to go through some of the economic indicators that we've seen, how they've changed, and some of the implications for that. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking about how companies should be thinking about their talent strategy based on what we've seen from an economic perspective. First, to start at the high level, looking at Q1 gross domestic product overall GDP, we had a 5% decrease from previous quarter. When you look at that, that was reversing the trend that we had seen in terms of ongoing growth in GDP. The first estimate for Q2 GDP will come out at the end of this month, but economists basically see that the recession officially began in February of this year, which was really as the curve was moving up from a COVID-19 perspective. So we'll be interested to see what the GDP looks like for Q2, but that's expected to further decline as we look at things overall. From a standpoint then of breaking that down in terms of the sources of spending and GDP breakdown, as most of you know, consumer spending really drives a great deal of the GDP in the United States, about 70%. When we look at where consumer spending was for Q2, it's estimated that we're basically at about a 13.8% decline and about an 8% increase in durable goods, about an 8% increase in non-durable goods, and then services were down 9.8%. Given what we saw from a COVID perspective, many of the restrictions from a lockdown standpoint and the uneven sort of opening around the country, most of these numbers aren't surprising, but they are pretty significant in terms of the amount of decline. Non-durable goods, you saw increases, especially in prices for things like groceries, et cetera, and some of that drives the increases. From a business investment perspective, it was down about 1.3% overall. Some increased investment from a residential perspective, but non-residential had declined. Government spending was up in that quarter, but we expect that this is going to start to decline as we start to see a lot of budget shortfalls from a number of state and local governments. We're starting to see a lot of local governments and state governments look pretty hard at what their next year's budget is going to be like and cutting back pretty significantly in terms of that. Imports were down, as were exports overall. So from a GDP breakdown, we saw weakness in pretty much every segment of the overall GDP. All the sort of higher level numbers are great and are interesting to look at, but we also want to try to look at what are the real impacts on people and what kind of stress are folks under at this point. When you look at some of the U.S. Census Bureau has a household pulse survey, and when you look at the recent one from July, there's a lot of disturbing news when you see in here. So 49.9% of adults with household in households basically lost employment income since mid-March. So basically 50%. 25.3% missed last month's rent or mortgage, or have little or no confidence in making the next month's mortgage payment on time, rent or mortgage payment. As many of you know, a lot of states had implemented eviction moratoriums and things of that nature, but some of those are beginning to expire. And so when you look at nearly a quarter of the adults saying that they're having trouble with their mortgage or their rent, and some of those moratoriums expire, we could be looking at some pretty significant issues from that perspective. About 10.6% of adults in households had food scarcity within the last 7 days, and 40% of adults have delayed getting medical care because of COVID in the past month. In some cases, that's because the services aren't available. In some cases, that's because of the concern about cost or the safety of actually going in and being in a hospital or in a medical facility. So when you look at some of the real impacts, they can be significant. When you look at the employment income, when you look at the concerns about mortgage and rent, these create a lot of stress, both for those who are working and for those who aren't working. So these are the kinds of numbers that really start to bring the impact of the COVID-19 home when you start to look at it. From a government spending perspective, we had obviously quite a bit of stimulus that had been passed previously, about 3.6 trillion total. As many of you know, Congress has been working on the next round of stimulus funding. Things like the unemployment, the increase in unemployment of about $600 a week is set to expire at the end of July. Many of the economists sort of look at that as having helped reduce the amount of decline or keep us from declining further from a standpoint of consumer spending and overall GDP. So it'll be interesting to see how some of that plays out, if some of that does expire or gets reduced, which is what it's sounding like in terms of what's coming out of Congress right now. Interesting impact from that, we had a number of clients who actually had difficulty getting some workers back who were essentially making more because of the increase in unemployment benefits, and that's part of the thing that Congress is looking at now, and why there may be some reductions in that overall increase from an unemployment perspective. So a lot will ride on what comes out of Congress next and how some of that stimulus works out. But there's been a tremendous influx, obviously, into the economy from federal spending and from federal stimulus. Also, some of the actions of the Federal Reserve in terms of trying to stimulate the economy and keep lending flowing. When you look at state and local governments, the numbers are, there's not a lot of solid numbers right now, but a lot of anecdotal information that says that many states are facing pretty significant budget shortfalls. Many local governments are facing them as well. We've talked to a lot of our local government clients, and many of them are very concerned about, where is the revenue going to come from in terms of being able to provide basic services, being able to provide some of the, culture and entertainment and parks and recreation and things like that that people really look forward to. So a lot of concern on the government side. Many organizations at the local government level in particular have done pretty significant furloughs, some for 3 or 6 months. Many of them dialed back on hiring from a temporary perspective, et cetera. All of that then has a ripple effect in terms of unemployment as well as spending in the economy. So a lot of concern in terms of where things are going next, and a lot of eyes on Congress in terms of what's going to happen from the next round of stimulus. Basically, when you look at the revenue shortfall estimations, some of the best estimations we have right now is about a $1 trillion local government gap by the end of 2021, and up to 5.3 million state and local government workers could lose their jobs because of those revenue losses, and that comes from the Economic Policy Institute. So we'll see how that plays out over time, but it'll be interesting to see what the impact of that will be. Looking at unemployment, many of you heard news that we've had some return in terms of jobs coming back, but it's very slow. When you look at it, March, April was a loss of 22.2 million jobs. In the May-June timeframe, there was a gain of about 7.5 million jobs, so only about a third of just what we lost in a kind of 2-month period. Peak unemployment went up to about 14.7%. When you look at the U3 unemployment rate, that number was about 22.4 when you look at the U6, which starts to count workers who are underemployed. And then we also look at current, and basically it's reduced to about 11.1% for June, or about 18.3% for the U6. Obviously, when you look at where we were from an overall perspective, down in the 4s, in some states down in the 3s, or even below 3 from an unemployment perspective, those are a huge gain from where we have been. So unemployment is still a very significant concern, still a lot of softness in the workforce overall, and I'll talk more about some other indicators in terms of that. But looking at the overall numbers, while we have seen some rebound, it's certainly nowhere near bringing back the gains in terms of what we lost. If you actually break down unemployment by race and ethnicity, and here we're looking at basically the percentage of the overall composition in the labor force versus the percentage unemployment. So when you look at the green, it shows the demographics and how much of the workforce they make up. And then if you look at the blue, it shows essentially what the unemployment rate is for those. When you look at it, basically all of the races except for white is essentially showing higher unemployment than their composition in the workforce. There's a lot of obvious discussion going on right now around social justice issues and racial equity issues, and you can see in some of the numbers concerns about where things really are. Similar when you look at the Hispanic or Latino population versus the non-Hispanic and Latino population, and where those stand from an overall unemployment perspective. More and more, we believe that companies are going to have to look at these issues, look internally, and really understand where they are from a diversity and demographics perspective, and understand where some of these impacts are. And certainly the national conversation will continue as we see some of these numbers and some of the concerns and disparities that are out there. Looking at unemployment insurance, basically the July 11th sort of time frame, 1.3 million that filed for unemployment insurance. Since essentially the beginning of the COVID impact, we've had about 51.2 million people apply for unemployment insurance. Most of you know the U.S. population is about 330 million, and so when you look at that number versus just the overall population, much less looking at it as a percent of the workforce, it's extremely high from an overall numbers perspective. When you look at the chart, it shows that from a 4-week moving average perspective, in looking at 2020, huge spike in March and April, and then started to see some decline in May and June, and now into July. But the numbers are still very high as compared to what we saw in terms of January and February. So when we look at the overall labor market, there's still a lot of softness there. There's still a lot of concerns in terms of people's ability to find jobs. We always look at job openings, and we also look at self-employed. Oftentimes you will see a spike in self-employed when you start to see overall softness in the economy. And if you start to see issues with both, overall job losses as well as no increase in self-employed, that shows you that the economy is even in worse shape. But to start with, over total job openings overall, you can see a very significant decline in 2020, and we're starting to see just a little bit of rebound in the most recent period as we were able to look at overall job openings. So the trend continues to be a relatively downward one, but we do start to see a little bit of an uptick in July from an overall job openings perspective. From a self-employed perspective, we did see a drop and then a little bit of an increase more recently in terms of that, but obviously still far below what historical levels have been over recent years, where the self-employed and gig economy has been strong. This is even though under the new rules that were propagated for COVID, a lot of self-employed workers were able to collect unemployment insurance when you look at that. So we're still seeing overall softness in the self-employed economy, even with that additional stimulus that's in there. So when we look at it, the immediate term prospects in terms of significant movements in the unemployment rate are low, and would definitely be in concern in terms of where we're heading. New graduates have also been impacted by this. Many of you who may have folks that are graduating high school or graduating college have seen some of the, difficult decisions that they've had to make and some of the challenges that they faced in terms of these. Even when you look at people trying to find summer internships or, summer work, that's been significantly impacted as well. But from a high school perspective, 1 in 6 of those who are planning on going to a 4-year college are not going to be doing so. They're not going to be attending. In some cases, they're taking gap years. In some cases, they're going to some sort of 2-year or trade school, but many are going straight into the workforce and looking for, immediate employment to try to address some of the issues there. From an overall financial aid perspective, the applications are down 45% from where they were this time last year, and that's really a combination of factors in terms of what's made that impact. One is that many people lost access to their guidance counselors or other support staff that would help them from a financial aid application perspective during the COVID pandemic and as schools went remote or to online learning. And in some cases, it's as simple as their main point of internet access was through school, and so they weren't able to access the internet because they were out of school. And so, when you look at some of these things, there's a lot of different implications there. When you project out into the future and, sort of a ready workforce in different skill areas, that's going to obviously reduce some of that. But it's also going to create increased competition for, what's already a scarce number of jobs for more people entering the workforce directly rather than going on to school. So that has the potential to even further exacerbate some of the challenges. From a college perspective, more than 1 in 5 companies rescinded summer internship offers. That's obviously a pretty significant component, not just from a standpoint of the monetary aspect of a summer internship, but also just the work experience, preparing people for the future from a job market perspective, et cetera. ZipRecruiter estimates that new postings for entry-level positions have basically fallen 75% since mid-February. So when you look at the implications of a lot of these things, it really sort of implies that there's going to continue to be softness in the job market, and people who are trying to be new entrants into the job market, some of the lower skill areas are going to continue to be some of the ones that are hardest hit or particularly hit from some of these things. When you look in some of that in terms of implications for companies, job security is going to be a big question on a lot of people's minds. Where is the company at? Where are they heading in terms of their overall employment outlook? How safe is the job that people might be applying for? It's also, a lot of people are going to look at their career path and say, what kind of stability does it really offer me over time? A lot of people who are in industries who have been particularly hard hit are starting to really reevaluate their career path and what should they do going forward. So it really speaks to the messaging that employers have to have in terms of their value proposition and what they're telling candidates and potential recruits, because those questions will come up in terms of where the company is. That's particularly challenging right now, obviously, because none of us really know what's going to happen in terms of COVID, further restrictions, the overall economy, et cetera. We're obviously seeing spikes in cases in many places across the country. A number of places have put in new restrictions. I know here in Colorado, we've had a number of new restrictions that have been placed on businesses, not just in terms of some businesses being closed, but changes in operating hours allowed and things of that nature. So a lot of uncertainty out there, and many people feel that, if we get into the fall and there's even more significant spikes, then a number of states or a number of cities could go into lockdowns again, and what will the overall impact on the economy be? So very tough in terms of messaging overall and being able to project out what the sort of financial implications are going to be of a lot of these pieces. Some numbers to think about. I mentioned the 51.2 million initial claims filed from March 21 to July 11. That's basically the period that we look at from an overall COVID perspective. So those are unemployment insurance claims. Basically 31.4% of the civilian labor workforce filed for unemployment claims at some point. From a good news perspective, consumer confidence has raised. Basically in June, it was at 98.1%. It had dropped down to 85.9% in May. So you are starting to see some rebound from a consumer confidence perspective. Lots of things play into that. In some cases, it's the reopening and some optimism about where things were going. In some cases, people look at the stock market and have some optimism around that based on how the stock market has been performing. But it'll be interesting to see really how this starts to move in terms of consumer confidence, given increases in cases, potential additional restrictions, and what we're seeing from an overall economy and unemployment perspective. The consumer price increased in June just a bit. We had seen a little bit of a downward trend in May, but overall you're starting to see some increase in consumer prices. I think a lot of folks are starting to see that in the grocery stores and places like that in terms of overall price increases, and a lot of that's being driven by some of the basic goods components that are either still encountering supply chain disruptions or other kinds of challenges in terms of getting things out there. So consumer prices increasing a bit in terms of that. So switching gears to look at leading indicators, we try to look at leading indicators and really understand, okay, where are we heading from an overall economy perspective? So the numbers are really not great in terms of that. Starting to continuing to see a decrease in commercial construction spending. We are starting to see some increase in terms of new single family household units that are coming online and sales of those. But a lot of challenges in terms of both consumers' ability to afford, as well as concerns about future income streams and how stable those are, as well as some tightness in the lending market. While mortgage rates have decreased and create an attractive opportunity in terms of financing new home purchases or those sorts of things, at the same time there's a lot of challenges in terms of the lending process, given some of the restrictions, some of the challenges that are out there. So that can sort of countervail that factor in terms of an attractive mortgage market. And then looking at the durable goods orders, which is oftentimes a leading indicator of some level of economic recovery. We did see some rebound in May, but it's still 18% lower than it was a year ago. So looking at May of 2019, we're still quite a bit down from where we had been previously from a durable goods perspective, and looking at what some of those might look like. So this is often one of the more reliable predictors in terms of economic recovery. So we'll see where this continues to go, but right now we're still seeing overall downward trend up from the very low points that we had gotten to, but not quite where we would like to see it as of yet. All of this is really leading a lot of our clients to work differently and think differently in terms of how they're doing their planning from an overall financial perspective. Most of our clients now are really looking at a multiple scenario approach to planning. So looking at different potential levels of economic recovery and what the impact would be on them, but also looking at the flip side where there could be more restrictions, continued softening in the economy, other factors that may create challenges challenges for them within their particular industry, and trying to model out financial scenarios that look at all these different paths and try to understand, what are the indicators going to be to tell us which path that we're going on. So a lot of organizations really changing their planning process and becoming much more disciplined about contingency planning and looking at different ways to understand where the overall economy is heading and what they should do about it. So as organizations, what should you really be thinking about now, and what should you be looking at, and both from a talent and an overall business perspective? First, it's a really important time to take a hard look at your talent and look at where there are talent opportunities. One of the fundamental questions that the organization really needs to ask itself is, do we have the talent that's going to take us forward and get us where we need to be in terms of the company's plans and where the economy is at and where the overall recovery and growth opportunities are going to be? So are there opportunities to actually upgrade key positions? Are there opportunities to look at certain positions where you may not have, as strong a talent as you would like, and look at upgrades? Because given where we are from a standpoint of the economy, there is good talent who really, through no fault of their own, may be out there and may be looking for jobs, or maybe in a company situation where they're looking to change and looking at what they might find in terms of future opportunities. So there's an opportunity to really take advantage of weaknesses in some of our competitors. If we see that some of our competitors are really struggling in terms of their overall economic perspective, doing layoffs, things like that, doing furloughs, et cetera, can you really take advantage of some of those weaknesses and some of those challenges in order to really upgrade your own talent pool? It's also a great opportunity to redefine your relationship with your talent. There's an opportunity to really look at, who is your key talent? What do you want that employee value proposition to really be for the organization? And really think about what that looks like going forward. Do you start to emphasize, where you are from a stability perspective? Do you start to emphasize opportunities in a different way in terms of where you think your growth is going to be? And it's also an opportunity to really rebalance your workforce composition. What do I mean by that? Looking at the body of work that needs to get done in the organization and starting to ask the very fundamental question of, what's the best way to get that work done? Meaning, what should be done by employees? What should be done by a contingent labor force? Where should we have people located in the United States or in other places? Many organizations are really rethinking their supply chain given some of the disruptions that they've had from COVID, and saying, do we need to do more here in the US in different locations around the country? What do we need to look at in terms of that? So taking a very hard look at all the different aspects of your business, what needs to get done, who should do it, what's the best way to do it. We expect that the overall trend of companies having a higher percentage of their workforce actually be a contingent workforce is going to continue and actually increase as we look at them moving forward. We have some large enterprises that over the past several years have basically moved to half of their workforce is essentially contingent, contract or some other kind of relationship that's contingent when you look at it, and we continue to see pushes in that direction. People want to be able to manage their variable costs as they look at it. But part of it too is just the very dynamic nature of the talent market and wanting to be able to sort of move and shift as the market moves and shift. So it's a great time and really an important time to take a very hard look at your talent strategy overall, look at where there are opportunities in terms of improving what you have from a talent perspective. The other thing that organizations should be looking at is really resetting expectations for leaders and thinking about what their development strategies are from a leadership perspective. What do I mean by that? When we look at what we've encountered over the past few months from a COVID perspective, it's really challenged a lot of leaders in a number of different ways. One is just being able to lead through uncertainty and help people really understand how to navigate through the times that we're in. That's both in terms of managing their business unit and the performance of that business unit, but also really looking at their relationship with people and how they manage people, where there are opportunities to upgrade the capabilities of our leaders in those areas. Things like virtual management as a skill is certainly much more important now. But we haven't even really begun to scratch the surface of how we look at accountability different, for example, how we look at performance management in this new world that we're going to be in, where things are much more uncertain, and the ability to manage supply chain disruptions, other things that might impact business results becomes much more important. So really rethinking in the post-COVID world, what are the critical success factors from a leadership perspective, and then taking the opportunity to think about how am I going to actually develop my leaders and develop the new skills that they need in order to be successful going forward. Obviously, being able to sort of drive. Being able to sort of drive a lot of in-person training and some of those things is not where it used to be, but thinking about other methods of learning, other ways to access learning and create development opportunities, even giving new leaders more opportunities to lead in this different environment. There's also an opportunity to look at some of the younger generations that are in your workforce and some of the talent that is in there, and say, what kinds of skills and things that we need can they really bring to the table. So for example, how do we leverage the technology savvy that many folks in the younger generation might have, in order to be able to improve the way that we work overall? How can we think differently about sort of what we expect of people in terms of being here in an office versus being remote, and what does that look like? So it's also a good time to really think about what are our expectations of productivity as we look through the workforce, and where a lot of that is heading. So just a great opportunity to look at what are the expectations of our leaders going forward, and how do we develop them along those lines. Another important aspect right now is really focusing on employee mental health and well-being. There are starting to be, some good pieces of research coming out, and some pieces that really look at how has the last few months really infected employees from an overall, stress management, isolation, a lot of those kinds of perspectives. And a lot of that research really says is that we're going to have challenges from an overall mental health and well-being perspective. A lot of organizations pre-COVID had built fairly robust wellness programs and other kinds of things, and many of those have been impacted by COVID, but that sort of offering is really going to be important moving forward. The sources of stress in terms of looking at where organizations are and what they need to do can come from a lot of different places. The economic stress I mentioned earlier, a number of sources of economic stress that people may be undergoing in terms of being able to, pay their mortgage, being able to, meet their obligations from a financial perspective. So that's certainly one source of stress. Certainly the overall tension in the world from a racial and social justice perspective is going to create stress for folks. Creates great opportunities to improve our workforces in those respects, but it also creates challenges and friction, and the kind of hopefully creative conflict that leads to change in some of these areas. But all of these things are really going to be challenging. Even looking at schools and where schools are going to be in terms of their reopening and how they're going to approach that. Many schools have started to look at, at least some level of return to online learning starting out, and then some sort of modified schedule, that might have people rotating in and out certain days, et cetera. But then looking at what that creates from an overall child care perspective, what the role of parents is going to be in terms of online learning, et cetera. A lot of challenges and a lot of concern, a lot of stress related to that. So when you look, and then to layer on top of that the overall uncertainty from an economy perspective, concerns about job security, et cetera, just a lot of things, a lot of stress that really that needs to be managed from a workforce perspective. It's a really important time to look at what you have in terms of support offerings, and think about how that might need to be upgraded or enhanced or changed as you look at it. But it also is really important that leaders are able to work with with the folks that they manage, and really understand where they're at, what some of their sources of stress might be, and what the company can do to help alleviate some of those things. Whether it might be something as simple as more flexibility to be able to, flex around particular schedules, or whether it's other kinds of assistance resources. All of those are going to be really important in terms of managing employees going forward. And companies who get this right really can make that part of their value proposition forward. Some of the things you should have already done, and we talked about this in the last webinar, one of the things that definitely you should have already figured out is what's the talent that you need to survive in the short term, and what's the talent that you need in order to be prepared for business recovery. We will start to rebound. We will start to see the economy turn around. There will be opportunities out there created by the crisis that we've been facing, and how well are you prepared in terms of really being able to take advantage of those things. Very important question to ask yourself, and hopefully many of you have done that already. Looking at your key talent and making sure that you've developed your sort of relationship building strategies. How do you use this as an opportunity to create more loyalty to the organization, more opportunity to develop them as leaders, et cetera. And then I think many of you have probably already been forced to enhance your virtual infrastructure, but definitely something that you should have looked at and be addressing if you haven't already addressed that. Other things that you should definitely be working on, and if you haven't started these things, you should definitely start to look at those. One would be enhancing workforce planning. This is really going to be a critical capability moving forward in terms of what HR can do for the organization. Given the level of uncertainty that's out there from an economic perspective and from a business performance perspective, HR has got to be far more nimble and far better at predicting what actions the organization should take based on what it sees from a numbers perspective. So having workforce planning really tied into your business development process, having a lot of predictive analytics that help you understand what's coming and what you should do about it from an overall talent, cost management perspective, et cetera. Looking at work processes and making sure that you've adapted those work processes to the future needs, whether it's addressing social distancing, whether it's really addressing the need for more virtualization, more automation, better knowledge management. In today's world, we never know when a critical resource might not be available. In some cases, just because the internet goes out right in their area. So we really have to look at how do we make sure that people can get the information that they need when they need it in order to be able to really drive and continue to move the business forward. And then really looking at key manager skills, virtual management, communication, talent relationship management, and increasing those skills in organizations. That's something that we all need to be working on from an overall organization standpoint, and making sure that we have those things built together. All of these things really creates significant challenges as well as significant opportunities for HR organizations and the clients that they serve. When we look at the HR talent that's out there, companies have to look just as closely at that HR talent and make sure that they have the right people in place with the right skills in order to be able to handle kind of the post-COVID workplace that we're dealing with. There's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what that's going to look like, what it's going to mean for real estate and employees in an office versus employees working virtually, et cetera. But we really as HR professionals have to look at the organization that we have and the talent that we have from an overall HR perspective and say, do we really have what we need in order to be able to manage in this new world and this new reality? And just like it's an opportunity to upgrade some of the business talent that's out there, it may be an opportunity to upgrade some of your HR talent as well, and really look at where you can improve in that respect. So no shortage of things to do, and this is certainly layered on top of all the additional things that HR has taken on in terms of employee safety and dealing with personal protection and equipment and testing and all of those other kinds of things. So the work for HR unfortunately never abates when you look at a crisis like this, but it really is an opportunity to increase the strategic impact that HR is making on the organization and continue to expand that business partnership and that strategic partnership that HR has the potential to do. So those are really some of the key things that we wanted to talk about for this quarter in terms of where we're heading from an economic perspective. Again, for us, it's going to be looking very closely at the next couple of months and seeing what the trends are, and especially as we start to move into children going back to school, we start to move into fall weather, normal flu seasons, et cetera. It's going to be really critical to keep a close eye on all these indicators and where they're heading. But I will open it up for questions at this point.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian. Wow, it's just some really impactful numbers there. I think you struck a chord when you started talking about the financial concerns and really how that affects employees on a day-to-day basis. And had a really interesting question about how should an employer identify employees that may be experiencing serious financial concerns, and how should they address them?
Yeah, good question. I think that we probably don't have a lot of good mechanisms, already set up for those kinds of things, and so it will really require rethinking strategies. The front line of this, of course, is the managers and supervisors in the organization, and hopefully they've got good relationships with the employees where they can, not necessarily go and probe people around those kinds of things, but create opportunities and create the space for employees to come and talk about those kinds of issues, and hopefully the company can help understand what resources to point them to. So the first thing is really making sure that you know what resources you have available, what resources you can leverage to help employees. Some companies have short-term loan programs or providers that provide some of those kinds of things. Other companies focus more on the mental health aspects through employee assistance or other aspects, but really looking at where there are opportunities to create a toolbox of resources that managers can leverage in that respect. But I think the second piece of the puzzle is creating more mechanisms where employees can anonymously or in a sort of safe way really look at the resources that the company has and access those without feeling like it's going to negatively impact their perception in the organization, et cetera. We've heard a lot of feedback on more recent engagement surveys and things like that um, people who are single parents or other things like that where they have some financial struggles are almost afraid to talk about those in the workforce, and afraid to sort of talk about that status, and are worried about the perception around that. And so the more that companies can create safe spaces to really have that dialogue and access those resources, I think is going to be really important.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point. Also, going towards the mental health and wellness aspects of what you discussed is, having that combination of the relationships with the managers and supervisors, but also that more, anonymous safe space so employees can choose, how they want to address those concerns. So good
Yeah.
information there.
And a lot of it's going to be dependent on your culture, and what sort of
Yeah.
really work in your culture. And so it's important to think through, what are the appropriate ways to make that happen in your culture and your organization.
We've had so many clients in our relationships of employers that have been forced to make a layoff, and I think there's an interesting question here about just the prolonged economic downturn and that next step of having to do an additional layoff, and that may encompass more critical talent that has to be laid off, and so I think just a question around what if we're forced to lay off more critical talent, what should we be thinking about?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I think that in a lot of industries where we're seeing these sort of prolonged, shutdowns or restrictions or things like that, or just a lot of uncertainty in terms of where the recovery might be, and there may be a lot of ups and downs going forward. I think a lot of organizations could end up in that situation where they have to cut further than they would have ever wanted to cut, and really look at those things. I think that there's two strategies that organizations need to think about. One is really thinking about the business that they're in, and what businesses they want to continue to remain in, and what things they can continue to focus on going forward. For some businesses, certain lines of business, et cetera, may just not be feasible in terms of where the overall economy is, et cetera. So there's sort of a business rationalization component that needs to happen, and really rethinking what do we do and how do we do it, and is some of it still sustainable as we look at it. Then based on, once you've answered that question, then you really have to look at talent and say, where are the folks that maybe they're not in the critical business lines now, but they really do have the skills, the competencies, the behaviors that we want or that we think can be successful moving forward. And how do we sort of retain them, even if it means really reshuffling, the chairs and reshuffling the talent that we have. So I think looking at the talent from an overall organization perspective and not just sort of a what are they doing now, what do they do for us today kind of standpoint, and really thinking about how do I retain those critical folks. But then when you still can't, keep all the talent that you want or keep all of the folks that you think are critical, really having the frank conversations about where the business is, the actions that you have to take, and what your plans are for the future. If you would like to try to bring some of these people back, having that conversation with them and talking to them about it. Obviously, you don't necessarily want them to sit around and wait for you to recover and not work, et cetera. But having the conversation of, we really do value you, we really value the contribution that you make. It's just where we are from a financial perspective, and here's what we'd like to do in the future if we can. So, being frank, being transparent with that talent is really important. Sometimes you get to a financial reality and there's only so much that you can do, but trying to keep that relationship so that you can potentially get that talent back in the future is really important, and making sure that they have as good of an experience as they can, when they're exiting the organization.
Yeah, that's a great point about the opportunity to revisit and come back again at another point when the economy comes back together. So you struck a vein with workforce planning, had some good questions around when you mentioned enhanced workforce planning. What are some of those key metrics and measures that you want to be looking at?
Sure. One of the most important things is being able to really tie together your pipeline, whatever that is, whether it's product sales, whether it's, you're a service organization, whether you do projects, whatever that might be, but really being able to look at your business development or sales pipeline and tying that to your resourcing strategies. The best way to do that is to really have the right predictive analytics to sort of match up that demand that comes from, potential sales, et cetera, to what you need from a labor supply perspective, and be able to get as far ahead of that curve as possible. So, not getting to the point where, oh, we sold a bunch of things, now we need to hire a bunch of talent, but really being able to look at the business pipeline and understanding, when that's coming and what that needs to look like, so that you can be proactive, whether that's as simple as bringing back people that you've laid off or furloughed or those kinds of things, or whether it's having to bring in new talent. So the first step is really having that clear tie to your business development or sales process, and having the right predictive analytics in terms of looking at future demand. The second thing, though, is really looking at your internal workforce indicators, engagement, productivity, turnover, things of that nature, and understanding not only what the numbers say, but what the drivers behind those numbers are. And again, trying to have predictive analytics to be able to say, okay, here's where we may run into problems because we're seeing this metric move this way. So we might expect that turnover will increase in a particular area or a particular job, or even being able to look at external factors like demand for certain positions in the markets that you're in and say, okay, here's where we may run into issues. And again, trying to be able to get ahead of that and being able to proactively look at things before they become problems. I think too many workforce planning sort of functions today are very rear view mirror looking, and they tend to focus on things that have happened in the past and aren't as good as really being able to predict where things are heading in the future. And that's a critical competency for going forward. It's one of those things that given where we are from an uncertainty perspective, the organizations that don't have those capabilities are really going to struggle both to capitalize on the recovery, but also deal with, other shocks or other things that come down the line.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that we had a website webinar planned on diversity and inclusion, and then your slide obviously on some of the social and race issues that are happening, and got a question on just given what's going on with all of the social justice issues becoming a bigger discussion in the workplace, and I think maybe a lot of employers are just unsure about what to do, and so maybe doing nothing or feel like they don't want to just, make a statement to put on their website. And so question around, how should we respond? What should we be thinking about in these times?
Well, there's a lot to that, I think. The number one principle I would say is whatever you do, be authentic about it. Make sure that whatever you do, you really it's tied into your company, who you are, and what you plan to do. I think there are companies out there who maybe have jumped on these kinds of things from an overall statement or PR perspective, but when it gets out of the news, probably won't, sustain kind of an ongoing focus on it. So I think you really have to ask yourself as a company, where are you with some of these issues? Do you have any sort of equity issues within the organization now? Do you have any discrimination or harassment or those kinds of issues that you need to address from a systemic perspective? And many organizations, frankly, just haven't really analyzed that and really looked at their organization in that way. We do a number of equity studies in organizations to try to understand from a wage, promotion, all mobility, all of those kinds of perspectives. Do organizations have any issues? And I think a lot of times organizations are surprised where they have them and didn't necessarily recognize them, because it may be something as simple as, in a business unit, there's a disparity in performance ratings, between males and females, or around a particular group in the organization. And so I think that knowing where you are and sort of knowing where you want to be from an overall perspective is the first critical step. I think the second one is, if these dialogues really just go on in the workplace with no help or facilitation or those kinds of things from the organization, they have the potential to really become polarizing within the organization. People can get very passionate about these issues, and rightly so. But how do you really manage that in an organization so that people can have this dialogue? It can be a productive and a constructive dialogue, and that people can still maintain their relationships, and that the conversations are actually productive, rather than sort of creating more divisions within an organization and that sort of thing. So from an HR organization, looking at what you have in terms of facilitators, the ability to really help with some of these communications and some of these dialogues that are happening in the workplace, as well as intervening quickly if problems do come up. All of those things are really important. How open and how sort of head-on an organization wants to address these things, I think, is very dependent on their culture and their workplace and the environment that they want to have. But I don't think any organization can afford to ignore them or not understand where they sit, and what some of the implications for their workforce might be.
Yeah, I really like that you started that answer with authenticity and how important that is, and really understanding where you are. And companies seem to be jumping to, we have to do something, we have to take action, and really just evaluating, is there an issue, and making sure you have a clear picture of what that looks like. So really good thoughts there. A good question about engagement that came in, engagement as we're measuring and thinking about employee engagement. And obviously for so many employers that looks different, or starting to look different with remote work and a lot of instability with jobs possibly and COVID pressures. So what are you seeing in the market, or what do you think's coming forward as far as ways to measure employee engagement or think about employee engagement?
Well, I think that we're going to have to get much more dynamic about that. I think that the utility of these sort of large periodic surveys is going to go down in a world where things are much less certain and are changing much more dynamically. So I think what you're going to see is more more regular or frequent measurement of different aspects of engagement and more timely topics that the organization can address more quickly. So for example, we just talked about the area of equity and some of those pieces. Right now, if I was an organization that thought, that even suspected that I might have some problems in that way, I might put out, a short survey that is really focused on some of those issues, try to get some rapid feedback, and then address that feedback very quickly in the organization. And I think that can be done with any number of topics as you look at it. And we've had a lot of success with doing that kind of thing in the past. I think that having a more short, focused, and frequent approach to measuring different aspects of engagement, then rapidly following up on those is going to become more the norm, because I think that the market and the workplace is just going to be too dynamic to wait to get that pulse every 2 years and then try to have these big initiatives related to that. And I think we're going to see data changing faster than we've seen in the past from an overall perspective. I think the other thing is that organizations, anytime they're looking at engagement data right now, have to put it in the context of what's going on in the organization as well as around the organization from a marketplace perspective, because the level of stress, the level of anxiety that's out there is going to impact people's engagement and where they are from that perspective. So I think that we have to keep that in mind as we look at engagement data right now.
Yeah, I like the quick pulse and really as the employer showing effective change from that, from those pulse and more rapidly making those changes instead of, as you mentioned, an annual survey that has, significant things that, may take a much longer decision-making time and turnaround time for a team, but to make those decisions faster and for the employees to feel the impact of their insight and feedback. So good points there. Well, we are close to the end of our time. Brian, thank you so much. Just incredible information. And as always, appreciate all of your insight and knowledge and expertise. And don't forget to visit our website, hrqinc.com and landromhr.com to check out all of our events and happenings, and obviously to register too for our upcoming webinar. And so on behalf of HRQ and Landrum HR, thank you so much for joining us today.